Welcome, everyone. So excited for our Lunch and Learn. Shilasi, everyone. We are excited to be featuring Kendall from the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center, who is going to be talking about supporting Indigenous people in urban settings. And we're excited to have that begin. So first, we want to begin by grounding ourselves in gratitude. Being a treaty partner means aligning with Mi'kmaq land-based values. So I want to invite you to consider where you are right now. Where do you feel most grounded? So as I prepare to do a land acknowledgement, maybe take a moment to think about, maybe you have a window and you can look outside. Maybe you're joining us from your patio or balcony. But if you are perhaps somewhere where there isn't a window, you might want to close your eyes and just think about where you feel most grounded and connected to the land. Maybe it's your garden, maybe it's the beach, maybe it's a hiking trail, maybe it's a park. But just take a few moments to take a deep breath and ground and just take that moment for gratitude for the land where you are. And as I prepare to read the land acknowledgement, I want to invite you to join with me in the chat and acknowledge the name of where you are located. So we want to, in the same way as there's dead naming and live naming, I've come up with the idea of live naming as opposed to dead naming. So if you're joining us in Halifax, please use the correct Indigenous name for that, which is Kijipuktuk. And I probably am not pronouncing that perfectly yet. I'm still learning. That's okay. Placenames.mapdev.ca is an awesome website because you can actually zero in on the specific town or village where you are located, and there's a way for you to practice learning how to pronounce. And the power of language is immense. And the Mi'kmaq language, we're actually going to be having an opportunity to learn from Kristen Basque tomorrow, who's going to be talking about what social workers need to understand about the power of the Mi'kmaq language. So please also plan on joining us tomorrow for that. But for today, please join and acknowledge that, but please maybe take a moment and also like share sort of what are the things that you're grateful for. So for example, I am joining you from Unama'ki, which is known as the place of fog. And when I think of fog, I never really saw the beauty of that, but I've been deeply meditating on it ever since moving here. And someone once said that fog is sort of like the universe, the sky is giving us a big warm hug. And whenever I see fog now, I can't help but think of that. So I might share that in the chat along with I'm joining you from Unama'ki, and that would be the way I might join. And I invite you to take a few moments to really personalize your land acknowledgement and to join with me. And so I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking from Unama'ki, which is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, whose inherent rights were recognized in the Peace and Friendship Treaties that were signed with the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy peoples from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. The treaties were later reaffirmed by Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982, and they remain active to this day. So we take this time to pause in reflection and gratitude for the land where we live and work. And when we acknowledge the land, we must also begin to acknowledge the wisdom of this planet and align ourselves with its truths. And we pause also in gratitude for all who have and continue to heroically care and advocate for this beautiful land. May we join them in this sacred work. Let us ground ourselves in the wisdom of the land-based Mi'kmaq teachings and values that we must all begin to learn. Let us work to decolonize ourselves, our practice, and this community that we share by working for justice for all living beings as an expression of our gratitude for being here. Let us take a deep breath and recenter ourselves away from the violent ways colonization fills our world and fills us. Let us take a deep breath and work on letting go of the unconscious bias that is everywhere, inside and out. May our session today lead us to be in right relationship with this land and with one another. We are all treaty people, so how does this impact what we do and how we do it, and how will it guide our work together today? We invite you to think about that and consider especially the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and specifically those that affect our work as social workers related to child welfare, health, justice, reconciliation, education, and language and culture. The Nova Scotia College of Social Workers commits to translating this acknowledgement into action by seeking to implement the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. We commit to doing what we can to becoming better treaty partners. We commit to learning and to unlearning, because we recognize that part of becoming safer is recognizing the interconnection of all forms of violence, whether it's colonization, patriarchy, racism, capitalism, terrorism, environmental terrorism, queerphobia. All of this is interconnected. And the new 2024 Canadian Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics calls upon us to shift from the illusion of neutrality to actively becoming anti-racist and fighting against racism and all intersectional prejudice that is part of colonization. And we recognize that it's a journey from denying that racism even exists, which is really just a reflection of fear, to beginning to let go of that fear, to acknowledge that we all have a role to play, to acknowledge that racism is there, and to learn without defensiveness or guilt. And that is a long journey that moves us towards a place of growth. And we recognize that we can't even begin to imagine what it might look like, that green arrow. We don't even know what's on the other side of that orange circle yet, because we're still not yet fully able to imagine what it might be to live in a world where racism doesn't exist. But this is part of a larger understanding of intersectionality coming from Kimberly Crenshaw, who was an African feminist theorist and who talked about the ways in which different forms of bias and colonial prejudice amplify each other. So when we think about decolonizing ourselves in our practice, it means recognizing the ways in which we are each impacted by the colonial system in which we all participate, and from which those of us of settler descent continue to benefit. Each of us, depending on our social location and intersectional positionality, are uniquely impacted or oppressed. For example, those of us from African descent were dispossessed and uprooted from their land and brought to Turtle Island against their will as part of the white supremacy and slave trade that fueled the settlement of this continent. So we take this moment to reflect upon the unique impact of colonization upon each of us in our practice, and we will have an opportunity to do that more today and reflect upon all of this as we get a chance to hear from Kendall. So very grateful. Many of you may have heard that Kendall spoke with us, and they were a very important part of our conference that we just had. And so we're very excited to welcome them back as they begin. So I'm going to stop my screen share and I'm going to spotlight them, and they're going to screen share, and we're going to get a chance to learn. Grateful to everyone for joining us.
Hi, everyone. So just stepping off from there, I'm Kendall, Gwen and Telewisi Kendall. I'm from Member 2 First Nation, and we're going to talk about social work with urban Indigenous folks. And I am an urban Indigenous person myself. I've spent the majority of my life living off reserve. So it's a very different experience and a very different experience when accessing services, particularly why the Friendship Center has even been evolved and created was to help out urban Indigenous folks, people who have moved off reserve for whatever reason, whether lack of jobs or often homophobia and racism and like lateral violence and all these different things. And I also want to state that it is Pride Month. Happy Pride Month, and also happy Indigenous History Month. Hopefully we get to learn together today. So here's a little bit about me. So my pronouns are they, them, or negum in my own language. I'm from Member 2 First Nation. I'm Mi'kmaq. Identify as two-spirit and also non-binary. I'm bisexual. I'm also neurodivergent. I have autism and ADHD. So all of these things kind of come together to not only form my own intersectional identity, but also how I practice with others. And we're gonna do a quick little crash course on identity because I could do an entire presentation about this topic itself, but just kind of talking about how identity is a really complex and controversial issue these days, especially as more pretendians and more people who have Indigenous ancestry that is like quite far back try to take space from those who are status or do have like at least direct connections back to community. But I think Indigenous peoples since the beginning of time have always been declared from external agencies, whether or not and not how Indigenous people identify themselves. Because Indigenous identity isn't just simply a personal identity, it's about what that person belongs to. It's about collective identity of indigeneity, of their band, of their cultural and family collectives, their kinship tais. It's important to understand the drive between like different policies and processes and how things have been used to assimilate our people into white Eurocentric culture as a tool of genocide. And initially how the criteria that was developed was decided to define who was or who was not Indian were quite expansive. However, the federal government over time realizing that narrowing the definition provided an effective means of reducing the number of people who met the criteria, thereby advancing their goal of assimilation. And I think that kind of goes along with a lot of things we deal with in social work practice in terms of like less eligibility, because that is something that comes up a lot in social justice programming and advocacy work. And the 1985 amendments to the Indian Act resulted in an increased number of people eligible for status. The increase put additional pressure on reserve housing and other resources, which were already under strain because they're so underfunded chronically, which is policy decision really. Funding to those resources did not increase, though, according to the increase in those who met the criteria for status. So basically setting us up for failure, setting us up so that we don't have enough resources for everyone, but then blaming us for not having those resources in place. So now focus on how Indigenous individuals and communities moving towards self-determination. So self-determining who is Indigenous, who belongs to certain communities, who belongs to certain family ties, and how that looks like is interesting. And especially here at the French Center, we kind of go and we want to believe people when they do come in and they're like, I'm Indigenous, this is thing, but we also kind of have to follow up, be like, hey, what is your family? What is your community connection? What is your connection to your culture kind of thing, so that we're ensuring that people get connected to resources. And talking about trauma-informed care. So this is an understanding that every Indigenous person on Turtle Island is a survivor of colonialism and genocide, and every Indigenous person you know is most likely a survivor of the day school system or the residential school system. For myself, my parents were both survivors of the day school system, and my grandfather and grandmother were a survivor of both the residential school system and the day school system. And basically everyone at that age in my family has had some at least kind of interaction with those very colonial harmful systems. And the core of like trauma-informed care, of like understanding that trauma is everywhere, but also understanding that this trauma also results in higher rates of things that people kind of view as problematic in our society a lot of the time, when really it's not anyone's choice. Often it's policy choices, it's not individual choice, it's structural and based in oppression. So like criminalization, higher incarceration rates, police brutality, violence, poverty, food insecurity, inadequate housing. A big portion of the houselessness community here in Jabuktuk is Indigenous, and particularly our Mi'kmaq. There's intimate partner violence, family violence, and a lot of this stems from the fact that colonialism targeted children to take them away from parents, take them out of community, out of culture, out of their language, because the Indigenous way of doing things was often as like a community and as viewing everyone as like kin, instead of having this kind of like nuclear family that we were kind of pressed into. And also this often results in like higher rates of substance use, mental health conditions, complex trauma and grief, suicide, self-harm. It definitely is reflected in the rates of missing and murdered Two-Spirit women and girls, higher rates of trafficking, and just regular racism, discrimination, and bias. And as Naz was saying, kind of like how that is integrated into every system that we work within, and also is integrated into everything that we've internalized over time, right? So living under systems that have been built to assimilate and ultimately eliminate you is deeply traumatic. Like, especially as a person living with multiple intersectional identities, systems we work within are not broken, they're working as designed. And that's an important distinction to make, because a lot of times social workers, like, yes, we are working to advocate and we are working to break down those systems, but understanding that those systems are intentionally designed to create more oppression and stigma and racism. Both trauma and violence happen within the social context, are deeply impacted by social determinants of health. And also, on a note of that, trauma-informed care, I want to also talk about kind of like neurodivergent affirming care, and about how like neurodivergency is often less frequently diagnosed in marginalized populations, particularly in Indigenous populations, because the same way that AFABs and FEMS are underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed, oftentimes that happens when the culture is different, when there is neurodivergency in households that has just been recognized and normalized a lot of the time, which leads to a lot of folks developing more trauma because they go underdiagnosed. And okay, so these are some tenets that are kind of from Decolonizing Therapy by Dr. Jennifer Mullen, and I just kind of wanted to include them to kind of have a bit of reflection of, these are definitely not all of them, I definitely could not fit them all, but just kind of talking about like, may we place a high value on the healing power of simply having choices. So choice-based care and trauma-informed care, and actually allowing people to have their own advocacy, actually allowing people to make the choices that they are going to make, and not ensuring that we're not pressuring people to make choices that they might be uncomfortable making. Especially with trauma, people are often fawners or people pleasers, and we want to make sure that we're giving our participants the time and space to make their own decisions and have those choices. May we transform together the mental and emotional healthcare system. May we understand that for change and healing to be sustainable, it must happen within all communities and systems. May I remember that I am not solely responsible for each individual seeking care, and engaging at an individual level is unsustainable and inhumane. It has to be a collective goal to increase care and increase trauma-informed care within our practices. And maybe all seek to dismantle all forms of oppression, recognizing that our freedom, rights, liberation must be collective, and therefore must include the most vulnerable among us. So those in those corners of all those overlapping intersectional identities. And maybe work on our own emotional ancestral shame, guilt, and grief. I think this is a big one, especially for non-Indigenous folks, because often the reaction comes from that guilt and that shame of like holding an identity that is now out of your control. The same way that my indigeneity is out of my control. It's just kind of something that I am. And we'll talk about intergenerational trauma, which is a big theme when working with any Indigenous person, and also a reflection that we need to be talking about more when working with Indigenous peoples. So it refers to ongoing wounding across generations, comes from systemic and structural violence and oppression and other collective trauma. So even when current generations do not experience the same traumatic injury, the effects of history influence the present through disconnection in relationships, disrupted teachings, traumatic meaning associated with family and community events. And those who experience intergenerational trauma may be more or differently vulnerable to new experiences of threat. So when you're living in a world and society that is not accommodating to neurodivergence or like differently abled folks or queer folks or trans folks, like there's another layer of that trauma going on, and without recognition and proper care, like the complex impacts of trauma can be mistaken for inherent characteristics of a person or group. So understanding that trauma-informed lens of not projecting onto Indigenous folks and not believing stereotypes, when a lot of those stereotypes actually, when you break them down, are just responses to colonial trauma and oppression that continue to happen. But I do want to make a note that like trauma is not the only thing that has been passed down through our ancestors. We have also inherited intergenerational love, wisdom, healing, and resilience. And healing this collective trauma requires connection, culture, and kinship. We must also seek out and celebrate Indigenous joy, strength, and pride. So ensuring that a lot of the times in social work and in research and things like that, that we're not constantly harping on the trauma and harping on the negative impacts that have caused from colonialism, and also shifting our focus onto like, how are we decolonizing? How are we getting better at doing these things? And okay, so we've all probably heard about anti-oppressive frameworks in social work, but these are some of the things that I wanted to point out as like tangible things that we should be doing. So like allow for critical self-reflection, like, and that sometimes includes being not the right social worker or not the right therapist to work with someone, and using your network and reaching out so that it's not just this individual trying to solve all the problems. And sometimes it means that you have to refer outwards and find the people who are right for that person. Engaging in active listening. So a lot of our cultures, and Mi'kmaq culture especially, is based in storytelling. So while you're filling out a form and someone might be like telling you their entire life story, and you're just kind of like, oh, well, I only asked this question, I only need this answer. Like a lot of times that's just how we speak a lot of the time. And like you will still get your answers, but you might also get a story. And the story helps you with context, and everything that participants share with you like is important. And ensuring that you're doing your own research and not kind of constantly pulling on like Indigenous coworkers to teach you everything, and making sure that you're pulling your own weight and doing your own work to decolonize and address your privilege, address any notions that you've internalized, like challenging power and privilege, identifying and naming the bigger issues, because a lot of the time people are not going to be able to self-care themselves out of systemic and structural issues. And that's the importance of like collective care is so important, because community is how we heal. Collectivism is how we heal. And like decentering yourself and your experiences is so important when working with Indigenous folks, because you're obviously not going to be able to reflect on someone's lived or living experience. And I wanted to say that personal healing and inner work are critically important to promote and advocate for racial equity, because structural issues cannot be solved by making different personal choices. But a lot of our programs and a lot of our practices are like, oh, well, they just need to stop using substances, or they just need to do this differently, or learn how to budget, when the core issue is capitalism or colonialism, and that they're not making enough money to survive. And that is something that we can't, we can give them all the tools to deal with all these things in their daily life, but we can't actually often cannot address the structural issues, those big issues, especially not alone. So talking about anti-racist frameworks. So this is a nice little list that I like to kind of pull out of like things rooted in white supremacy. So perfectionism, individualism is one that I've been talking about a lot, like objectivity, power hoarding, right to comfort is a big one, where white people and non-Indigenous people alike feel that they don't want to have those uncomfortable conversations. They don't want to be uncomfortable, when a lot of this work and a lot of this inner work is going to be uncomfortable, and accepting that. Either or thinking, worship of the written word, which is a big thing with Indigenous communities, because so much of our traditions are passed down orally and through storytelling and through petroglyphs and other things that are not the written colonial tongue. Progress is bigger. There's one right way to do things. Defensiveness is a big one that comes up when having these conversations about anti-racism. Fear of open conflict is a big one too, where like people don't want to have those conversations because they're uncomfortable. And it's so important that we have allies and non-Indigenous people and social workers who are willing to actually work in allyship. And I also appreciate the term accomplices in like that anti-racism work, and being able to call out coworkers and participants even when they are kind of like spewing like racial stereotypes and things. Like we need to call it out when we see it, and we can be gentle about it, we can be nice about it, but also sometimes it's just going to be uncomfortable, and that's also going to be okay. But things we might do if we haven't done our own personal healing and inner work are like projecting our own insecurities, becoming angry and defensive, told that our action behavior is harmful, when really when things are harmful, it's okay just to apologize and move on. Like the example I use the most, I think, is with like pronouns. Like if people don't get my pronouns correctly, like I'm like, oh, I actually use they, them. It's kind of like, I don't want an entire explanation of how you have like a trans friend and that like, oh, I'm like, just say like you're working really hard and correct yourself, apologize, move on, so that it doesn't make it a big deal, really. Like prioritizing niceness and politeness and over confronting hard and uncomfortable truths of oppression. So especially in our Canadian culture and our maritime culture of like niceness and politeness, it's really easy to like hide our racism a lot of the time, and it'll hide like queerphobia and things like that, because like, oh, Canadians are so nice, or like Maritimers are so nice, when really it's just that we're not as outwardly racist a lot of the times as like say the States, but we still are just as racist and have been built from the same structures of oppression. Becoming angry when people set healthy boundaries is a thing, lack of accountability, how we have perpetuated harm and oppression of others, because that's a hard thing to accept for us, but it is something that inevitably we're all going to do. And the important part is actually acknowledging it and moving forward and committing yourself to unlearning and learning. So I know that Naj already had a little version of this, but just talking about like a becoming anti-racist framework. Oh, you're laughing now. Just wait till the next slide. But just talking about like how that comes from like internalized fear of like being uncomfortable, and how we need to be learning and moving into that growth zone of like speaking out and sitting with discomfort and yielding positions of power for those who are otherwise marginalized, like speaking out in rooms that people aren't in and questioning who's not in the room when we're in those meetings and when we're in those spaces. And this is also from not just PowerPoint, but talking about kind of things that we always go over is like wheel of power and privilege, like where do we fall on those? And my one thing that I did want to bring up is the example of knowledge of language and how important language is to Mi'kmaq folks and Indigenous folks as a whole, and how Indigenous people's first language might not be English. And we have to be careful that we ensure people are understanding us and understanding the reasoning behind why we're doing things, and like ensuring that we're being trauma informed by explaining, oh, this is why I'm doing this. This is the reasoning for putting you on this treatment plan. This is why I'm putting this referral, all these things. And oftentimes in the listening piece, we have to ensure that like people can listen and people can agree, but like, is there full understanding happening? And like ensuring if we need an interpreter or translator or someone who knows Mi'kmaq culture to be in the room, then they should be in the room. And that whole intersectionality piece, I know we've touched on it, but kind of talking about how Kimberly Crenshaw originally, it was about Black women and Black womanhood, and how it was very much about race and gender under patriarchy and misogyny, and how all of these intersections can overlap and make such a unique experience for us. But race is such a big one. It's such a thing that is so deeply ingrained, even if it is just a social construct. It doesn't mean that that has not had profound effects on how we live our everyday lives. And so this is from, oh my God, I believe I cut off the thing and I'm like, now I don't remember where it's from, but talking about the colonized mind. So it's from Slow Factory, it's right there. But talking about how these systems of oppression are really internalized in our brains from like birth onwards, and talking about how like rape culture and Zionism and misogynoir and ableism, transphobia, homophobia, internalized racism, fat phobia, like all these things are constantly taught to us as we grow up. Like even the example like of diet culture and how heavily ingrained that is, and how restriction is so like not a thing that like people often think about when they're just saying to people like, oh, I skipped like breakfast or I did things. Like they're not fully accepting and understanding all of the different structural issues that result in that action. So talking about how we must be willing to learn and to unlearn, especially because we're taught through a lens of white supremacy and colonialism. Like even in my social work programs, I remember that there was kind of like a week where we were like, oh, that's diversity week. Like we talk about all the Black authors and all the Indigenous authors and all the queer stuff in one week, when like we deserve to have entire courses dedicated to these paradigms. And we've internalized the colonial way for so long that it's become so normalized for us, and how we continue to fight against it and make it not normal. Like how we have to question what normal is and how we got it. True reconciliation requires us to unpack our internalized biases, be actively anti-racist, and not shy away from politics within our practice. Because a lot of folks who are like, oh, like I don't talk about politics, like politics are going to do you regardless. Like everything is political. The fact that you're able to even attend this during your lunch break, or have access to a computer, or be in the job you're in, or be in the house you're in, like everything is based on policy and legislation. So like no matter what, how far you try to remove yourself from those things, like they are still going to have an impact on your life. And lived and living experiences are just as valuable, if not more valuable, than formal education. I always say that I do work from lived experience and formal education, because formal education is not an accurate metric of intelligence due to the amount of barriers that are in place to access it. And there's so many people who are so smart and would be able to do all the work if they just had different circumstances, or were given the tools to access the same way that some cishet white man might. And talking about decolonizing practice, so I am of the thought that like not everything can be decolonized. Some things just need to go. Some things need to just be burned to the ground. But we just need to be not just understand and be aware, but also take activated action. So ensuring that our actions always speak louder than words, and that we should be often centering Indigenous voices. And in decolonizing practice, like we need to be centering definitions and practices that have come straight from Indigenous people. And decolonization should always be grounded in Indigenous frameworks, not colonial ones. And decolonization is about reacting to the oppression that Indigenous peoples continue to face within settler nation of Canada. Decolonization involves actively deconstructing and challenging colonialism and its systems that often don't account for the lives of Indigenous peoples and our cultures, our languages. Requires the roots, the ideas rooted in the colonial framework be dismantled and challenged, because most social work frameworks come from white, Eurocentric, patriarchal, settler frameworks. Like social work was not inherent to Turtle Island. It was something that was brought here. It was invented and pushed onto our people. So like, how can these frameworks ever really be inclusive? If that's where they're stemming from, like that's the root of what's going on. Colonization impacts us all by perpetuating systems of oppression, erasing Indigenous knowledge and cultures, perpetuating inequalities and structural issues, including colonialism, informs and reinforces all other structures of oppression. So racism, ableism, classism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, etc. And decolonizing requires a systems perspective rather than pathologizing and individualizing, which is often what social worker does. What social work is meant to do is to pathologize folks and pathologize trauma and things that people are doing to survive in worlds and in spaces that are not meant for them. And to address these, we need to redress the roots: harm in colonization, residential schools, the Indian Act, family separation, kinship ties lost, ongoing injustices, Eurocentric views on trauma treatments locate harms within individuals without acknowledging culture, not targeting systems meant to displace harm and separate Indigenous peoples from our communities, our cultures, and the traditional way of knowing and doing and being. Reconnection to Indigenous ways of knowing, doing, and being, and rejection of white supremacy is so necessary within this framework. We too often focus on self-care, as I was talking about earlier. So decolonizing this means that we must move away from a focus on individualism and moves towards cultivating communities of care. And like being able to have circles of care is something that I really try to do in my practice, of like ensuring that if this person is being supportive by this organization and they're connected with this person here, that we all get in a room and that we're all in the same place. So we're able to say like what people's individual roles and what their capacity is for helping that person. Okay. talking about culturally safe and culturally relevant practice. So oftentimes the relevant part is left out of like how oftentimes there's like a pan-indigeneity that is applied liberally to all decolonizing practices when like there's like 600 different communities across Turtle Island that all have their distinct cultures, language, traditions, all these things. So talking about that, how we cultivate relationships and community, and colonialism thrives on isolation and maintains separation. So like these silos that we find ourselves often in social work are directly linked to how white supremacy maintains this, so that we don't work in collectives, that we don't work towards like collective change and healing. So talking about acknowledgement of structural issues, like I often bring up like, oh, well, that's often like internalized capitalism, like this grind culture and productivity, and like knowing that a lot of people are not capable of doing the things that neuronormative society wants them to do oftentimes. Acknowledgement of the complexities of intergenerational trauma and also intergenerational grief, because there is such a big overlap between the two, and not just grief of like people and communities, but also like I don't speak my language. And the reason I don't speak my language is because when I was growing up in the 90s, the Canadian government was really pushing that teaching a second language at home would be really confusing and would not benefit me. When really, in working in the urban indigenous community, like it would absolutely benefit me and would be such a strength. And yes, I am trying to learn and like to learn all these things, but like to know that if that policy was not around, then maybe my parents would have thought differently, because both of them are fluent speakers. Like it's their first language for both of them. My dad didn't learn English until he went to day school at 5. So like importance of accessing language, ceremony, community, like being able to attend powwows, being able to smudge and access medicines is so important to collective healing in Indigenous communities. And allowing for smudging is a big thing that people run into a lot of the time in places. And I know that the IWK has changed their policy, but really like it's everywhere that needs to address their policy, because like often like in this building we smudge all the time. It has never once set off a fire alarm. Like it's never anything that has put anyone in danger. If anything, it's the extremely important grounding practice for folks, and it makes people feel so safe and connected. And using practices that are based in Indigenous culture, like even if you're non-Indigenous, like ensuring that you're still having that Indigenous kind of holistic view of things and how things are so interconnected in health. Uh, Effective self-disclosure. A lot of our teachings and even like ethics are very like colonial and based in that white supremacist kind of individualized view of things, and how we should never share anything of ourselves. And I found that like if I didn't share anything about myself, like my clients would not trust me. Like I have to often like say I'm like, and it's not the same as like taking away from someone's experience or like making it all about me. Like it's just about ensuring that I am communicating that I do understand, because I'm also Indigenous, like I'm also queer, I'm also neurodivergent in sessions with people, and ensuring that like that builds rapport, it doesn't break rapport or create mistrust in any way. And I think understanding that like there's been so much harm from not only the social work professions, but all health professions, that there's such an importance to be transparent in our communication, in our relationships and trust, and ensuring that we're building rapport that is based on authentically who we are and how we can work to create safer spaces for everyone, because there's not going to be a safe space for everyone, but like making sure that the environments we're in are safer is very important for inviting Indigenous clients into spaces. And so like here's some questions I kind of want everyone to kind of consider, talking about how wellness from an Indigenous perspective is like a whole and healthy person expressed through a sense of balance of spirit, emotion, mind, and body. And central to wellness is the belief that one's connection to language, land, beings of creation, ancestry, supported by safe and caring relationships, and also environments. So asking yourself, how am I signaling safety for Indigenous participants? Like, for example, this is one of the offices that I often do therapy in. Behind me, there's Indigenous artwork, there's a plant in here, there's soft lighting. I usually don't have this big light on for sessions. but like, do I have anything to make Indigenous participants feel welcome, like that you might know something about, like Mi'kmaq culture or Indigenous culture? Have you unpacked any racist biases or stereotype about Indigenous people that you might hold? Have you made an effort to educate yourself? Do you actively practice allyship? And not just allyship with Indigenous people, but with like queer Indigenous folks, particularly during like Pride Month, like ensuring that we're putting 2S at the beginning of the acronym because that is where it's supposed to go. Do you follow any Indigenous creators, artists, activists? Like, do you communicate with other Indigenous social workers? Do you allow space for ceremony, traditional healing practices? Do you ask about them? Do you allow people to smudge? And also, like, have you read the reports? Like, not in their entirety, but even just like the calls to action or the national inquiries, calls to justice. Like, there is an entire section in the calls to justice specifically around social service workers. And like, they are things that are not just recommendations, they are calls to action. There are things that need to be implemented for us to change anything. And I do want to quickly talk about like medicine wheel. So talking about how Indigenous people often view health and their well-being as a collective, holistic way. So medicine wheels acknowledges the interconnectedness of families, individuals, communities, and connection to ancestors. Represents an interconnected, holistic perspective. And the intention is that all components are meant to be maintained in balance to ensure health and well-being. So the mental, spiritual, physical, and emotional, and ensuring that like you're asking clients like, okay, like we're not doing anything spiritually like satisfying. Like, how is that affecting their overall health and that balance of well-being? And like indigenizing practice might be just like printing out a blank medicine wheel and being like, okay, where are we going to put things that we do for our mental health on this wheel? And even like coping tools and adding things that are relevant to the person, because everyone's if you've met one Indigenous person, if you've met some person, like you've only met one Indigenous person. So it's like ensuring that while these practices are pretty widespread and like pretty pan-Indigenous, ensuring that like that person even wants that Indigenous lens, because some don't. And like ensuring that they just trust that like Western systems works for them, like that's fine. But like ensuring that you're giving the option, that importance of choice. And talking about how like we should be working from and living in Mi'kmaq sacred teachings. So love, honesty, humility, respect, truth, patience, and wisdom are the Mi'kmaq sacred teachings. There are some, I believe, that are different from the Ojibwe teachings that are usually the most like universal ones that people see. But like, what would it be like if we lived the 7 teachings and practiced those towards not only ourselves, but to others? How can we implement these teachings in everyday practice? And I think one big way that I do is like that I hug clients when they need it, and I use a comforting touch in sessions just to kind of like ensure that there is that connection and rapport, and it's not inappropriate for me to do so. It'd be more offensive of me not to hug a client when they want and like need it. And ensuring that we're kind of taking that decolonial lens to everything, like dress codes and policies and ethics and codes and things like that, and ensuring that we're always kind of questioning things that are going on and why are things the way they are, and naming why. So white supremacy, colonialism, capitalism, the big 3 things. And I did want to talk about just like the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center. So my position is I'm the mental health counselor. There's 2 of us that work with the urban Indigenous population. We also have a cultural facilitator and a cultural advisor that work with us. And there's a lot of programs that the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center provides. So this is just kind of quick little overview. I was impressed that I fit this all in one slide. So we have like everyone every day, which is our neighborhood shop. We have like Sitamuk, our cultural post, which is a store out on the waterfront. We have employment and skills training. We have an Attila High Inuit program, seniors programming, cultural mentors for Indigenous youth, active living, Indigenous mental health and wellness. We have the Wajaywinan Health Center, which is our clinic here that's been open for almost a year and a half now. So people in the urban Indigenous community can have access to a doctor and healthcare. And we have like a mental health nurse and a physiotherapist and a nurse practitioner. And we have a lot of supports in harm reduction. So Posse and also Direction 180, mainline needle exchange. We have access to post-secondary programming. It's not called a GED anymore, but I don't remember what the new acronym is. There's also now a Mi'kmaq language class that's going on, Seven Sparks Justice Program, so helping those who are leaving incarceration. We have a victim support navigator, family support services. So we have like a Mi'kmaq Child Development Center, which also hosts like parenting groups, connection to Jordan's Principle. So Jordan's Principle works with families to ensure that Jordan's Principle is being implemented and supporting them in getting things that they need, like whatever that is, even if it's like a bed for their kids or like a new dresser. We have an early years program for folks who are parenting. I believe it's 0 to 3 parenting journey. So teaching parenting skills to people, because a lot of that Indigenous way of parenting and knowing has been disrupted. So bringing those teachings back. There's urban Indigenous youth outreach. And our housing program has also really exploded over the past few years. I used to be an housing intensive case manager, so it's very much an issue near and dear to my heart. But we have housing support workers, intensive case managers, criminal justice housing support, so helping those who are facing criminal charges or coming out of incarceration. We do have a safe house called Fourplex, which houses women and children and Two-Spirit and trans folks. Sage House is for women and Two-Spirit folks, trans folks. It is a 9-unit residential complex, and there's Diamond Bailey Healing Center, which is on College Street, which is also an all-gender healing center. It's really not meant to be a shelter or anything, but it's supposed to be like supportive housing for the time being to kind of move people on and ensure that they are healthy in doing so. That was a lot, but that's my spiel about all the things at the Friendship Center. If you'd like to know more, please, feel free to come down. There are tours going on all the time, and like our front desk staff is super sweet. And we have events all the time too. Like I would definitely suggest following our Facebook. We have an Instagram, and I typically post like all my workshops and all the workshops that are going on there. So make sure you stay connected, because a lot of things, especially all the programs are mostly for specifically urban Indigenous folks, but everyone every day also is just like a full community thing. So everyone is invited to that neighborhood shop and any programs they might put on. So talking specifically about mental health supports that are available for urban Indigenous folks. So if someone has status under the Indian Act, they are accessing non-insured health benefits. So if you are thinking of like practicing private practice, like ensure that you reach out to NIHB and that you're able to direct bill, because this is often the only way that Indigenous folks have that access to counseling. And it covers medications, therapy, other health related needs, has a navigator that you can call with connecting clients to resources and answer questions about coverage. I meant to put the navigator's information here, but they work out of the Atlantic Policy Congress of First Nation Chiefs Secretariat in Cole Harbour. So if you just look up like APC FNC, the NHB navigator is on there, and she is great and super helpful. And our team at the Friendship Center, so have our information. Christina is our navigator, so she does kind of first base intakes with folks and either directs them to internal resources or external resources, depending on the situation. And she gave me permission to put her information in here, so that is there. And also I just want to include that the Exosoni Mental Health Center also has a 24/7 crisis line that if you have folks who are Indigenous, who are in need of it, that's there. And I just kind of want to end it with some recommendations of like what can you take from this? What are you going to do moving forward? So like reading and implementing the calls for action, calls to justice into your practice, centering and restoring Indigenous understandings of health and wellness to move towards collective healing and decolonization, uplifting and including Indigenous voices, lived experiences, and perspectives, contribute to ongoing education, policy development within all service provision, context to address racism and all other forms of oppression, identifying relevant resources, be ready to refer someone in need. Like if a lot of people don't know about all the programs that we have at the Friendship Center, and ensuring that that information is out there is a big part of like knowing where to send someone who is in need in the urban Indigenous community. Work to identify and unlearn internalized biases, prejudices, assumptions, and stereotypes. hold each other, our friends, families, communities, and organizations accountable when they contribute harm against Indigenous peoples or fail to recognize them. Acknowledge that you are and cannot be an expert on the lives of people with completely different lived experiences, and that's completely okay. And understanding that all oppression is interconnected, and we as social workers cannot remain neutral in the face of injustice. And this is where I add the whole, free Palestine. Like, Palestine is such an interconnected issue, and that touches on everything going on and everything that I've spoken about today. And we cannot be neutral in those situations. Neutrality is siding with the side of the oppressor. And that is all I have. But well, yeah, thank you for listening to me ramble over your lunch.
This is not rambling. This is so much wisdom, and I've already gotten several people who've messaged me with email. So I put my email if you want a copy of Kendall's amazing, awesome presentation. You are welcome to message both of us, or just email me and I can send you the presentation. There are questions coming in. So one is, are Indigenous people from the Annapolis Valley able to access services and support from the Friendship Center, which is related to another question that was sent to me individually, which is what can be done to create or support or advocate for Mi'kmaq Friendship Centers in every community, because it's clearly such a need. What can be done to support and amplify the work you all are doing?
Yeah, and touching on that, like, the Friendship Center is such a unique invention where it is specifically for urban Indigenous folks. We do mostly connect services solely with folks living within HRM. But I mean, if people are living in the city, like, no matter what community you're from, they are free to access services and programs. And I mean, if people want to come in for programs as well, that's totally acceptable. And also that, like, a lot of how the Indian Act is set up is how off-reserve folks often don't get the same resources and support that on-reserve folks do. And it's basically just kind of divide and conquer strategy, really, of ensuring that those who move off reserve and other urban Indigenous people are left out of programming and all these things. But often individual communities do often have their own specific, like, health centers and Jordan's principle and things like that. And yes, people without status are free to access services at the Friendship Center. Usually the follow-up question is, like, just asking about, okay, like, do you know what community your connection with? Do you know what your family connections are and things like that? And those kind of kinship relationships and proximity to your indigeneity, really, of, like, but if you know where you're from, who your family is, that's completely valid. And, like, obviously, as I talked about, like, status is meant to kind of create less eligibility. So, like, if we only serve those with status, it wouldn't be, like, as busy here. Like, we wouldn't be able to serve the amount of people that we do.
Right. And so another question that has come up have to do with, yeah, so email me, I'll put my email again, but I have a copy of Kendall's presentation, so I'm happy to send that to you all. Questions are, I'm getting some questions from allies and accomplices who are wondering about how they can support without overstepping. So is it appropriate for someone who's not Indigenous to smudge, for example, in order to create safe space for people? And also someone was like, what would happen if they started or helped to start something similar to the Mi'kmaq Friendship Center in a town or village where they were, if there are several people who might be able to benefit?
Yeah, and I think in terms of those questions, like, that would be, like, the more supports the better, the more nonprofit organizations that pop up and, like, in support of Indigenous populations, the better. And the question, my God, I totally forgot the first
Oh, it
question now.
was about smudging. Can a
Yes, and also,
non-Indigenous social
yeah,
worker
if
smudge to
you're,
help create safe space for
everyone
them?
should be allowed to smudge. It's really just the ensuring that you're respecting and ensuring that you're getting your medicines from appropriate and sustainable places and sources, and that you're supporting Indigenous business when you are
Not
reaching out to
ethically.
get those things.
Got it. We have someone who is wanting to who I think might have raised their hand, and I think we can invite them to unmute if they would like. Katrina, if you want to unmute, you should be able to. If not, chatting might work better with your question, or maybe you didn't mean to having, I guess, okay. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat if you have any questions. And I think we are kind of out of time though. So unless that question comes through, I'm not sure if that was intentional or
Yeah,
not.
and I'll put my email in the chat as well. If anyone has follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me. Thank you, Nash, for inviting me. It's been really great.
Oh, thank you so much. I've been getting lots of emails as well, so just saying how grateful everyone is. So Willalan, we are deeply, deeply grateful to you for your wisdom, and everyone feel free to contact us for this, a copy of the slides. A lot of people said you had so much information on there. So, and for the overlap, that just is, I think, reinforcement that the college is on a good goal, on a good track. As we work to decolonize ourselves in our practice, we've been learning from our Indigenous and Mi'kmaq social workers who've been helping us to decolonize ourselves in our practice. Kendall, I hope this is not the last time that the NSCSW gets to learn from you, because you have a true gift of being a teacher, and we are much wiser thanks to you. So thank you so very much. I think especially the way you framed what decolonization means to help us understand the ways in which certain things like perfectionism, and you talked a lot about not being defensive, and the most that I'm learning is how can we learn to tolerate shame, right?
Yeah.
Because shame is, I think, the thing that stands in the way of us and being able to own our part, the ways in which we've all internalized this bias. So I don't know if you have any closing words about that.
I feel like just reiterating that, like, doing your own inner work and like valuing yourself as a social worker is so important to like being able to be a positive person, a positive ally and safe person for that. And I think you're already doing a great job.
We are grateful to you for your learning and for helping us unlearn so much of what we've been taught. Willalan, thank you, and may everyone have a wonderful rest of their
Well,
day.
and the Maltas.
Minoltas.